Okay, so what were you thinking? You were thinking that the debate would be drawing people from the crowd. So if you think that, then we should go tell Donio that now, yeah? Okay. Let's do that then. Okay. Okay. So how about this? And then we can chat.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining for this lecture. This session will be a little different from the last ones because today we have a special speaker, Marieke van Vocht from Groningen University in the Netherlands. Marieke is a cognitive scientist and a neuroscientist who was working on mind wandering, or is still working on mind wandering, and was and is investigating the neuroscience behind Nalanda debate for a couple of years already. Maybe she's introducing her research in the last couple of years too in the next couple of minutes. Marieke was organizer last year of the first debate winter school, so it's really great to have her with us today. She's been involved with Sarah J. for Monastery for quite a while. Maybe she's better at explaining the details than me here. And she's also still involved in a weekly program with the science department of Sarah J., where she's furthering her studies. And Marieke and I met when 2, 3, 4, I don't know, messing up times, 3 or 4 years ago, and we did our collaboration. My introduction into the Tibetan Buddhist community here started out with a program, with a project that investigated the structure behind Nalanda debate from a more information point of view. So this was all very productive, and it's great to have Marieke here with us today to introduce her research a little and to teach us a bit more about scientific investigation and exploration of Nalanda debate. So thank you very much again, Marieke, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you all very much for being there. I'm so excited that this is already the second debate winter school, and I'm very sad. This is only the first time I'm showing up on the stage here or even in the virtual monastery, because I've been watching some of the YouTube, but my days have been just insane in the past week. This is just a particularly bad week in terms of meetings. So that's why I'm only here now, but I'm excited to meet you. And I did get to virtually meet some of you in the WhatsApp group, which is very active. So I'm very excited that you guys are so into the debate and already like are thinking about it constantly. So that's great. So yeah, let me share just a little bit about the kind of research I've been doing with monastic debate, which is really what, in a way, is one of the roots maybe of the existence of this very winter school, because in 2015, I had the opportunity to go and teach Tibetan monks in India about my research on meditation. And in that process, I saw a lot of them debate, and I was fascinated. And together with several colleagues, we found a little bit of funding to allow us to go to India for a first trip. Well, actually, I think I went to India to teach in 2014, and our first research meeting was in 2015. And actually, Geshe Tapkela, whom you've also been meeting here, I think, was part of that first meeting. We met some Tibetan monks. We had absolutely no idea what they were doing. We just looked at it and it looked kind of exciting. And we started to think about, how can we study this scientifically? What is it doing to their minds? What is it doing to their brains? And so on. So I'm going to share with you now, several years later, how far we've come in studying this. But obviously, as Stefan already said, this is an ongoing process. So we're still meeting, well, not every week, but every other week, or roughly. We're meeting now online through Zoom, which is very cool. And I will share a little bit about what we're doing in the Zoom as well. But yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without me visiting the monastery. And the connection to this winter school, by the way, is that in some of these studies, actually, Venerable Dunyola, who has been like the person who makes this winter school run together with Stefan single-handedly, I met him as a participant, and then we got into some conversations, and then we got into like, what are you guys actually doing? And he taught me some debating, and then we felt like, well, maybe we should scale this up and teach more people about debate. So that's the history from my perspective, at least my component of the history. So now let me actually start my presentation. It's always good to start with some history. So here we are. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about where we got. It's just a flavor and a taste, and I'm very excited to hear your questions and comments. So please feel free to pop things in the chat, or if you have a complicated question, feel free to come up to the stage. I think that's what we did last year, at least, for our question asking mode. But for now, I'll get started. So of course, this is not just my work, it's a gigantic team. And it started with Nawang Norbu, who was at that time the head of the Science Center, and then some of the monks, and Geshe Tapkela is there too, and some Western scientists, and Bryce. Bryce is the CEO of Science for Monks and Nuns, who was the one who helped to build a connection. And I'm probably forgetting some. I mean, there's also a bunch of students that have been doing their bachelor and master projects on the data of this whole enterprise. So it's really a village to study such a complicated thing as debate, because from a cognitive science perspective, it is really, really complicated. So when you think about it, at least you can distinguish several skills that are involved in debating. So for example, say here we represent the debates time on the vertical axis. So as time progresses, initially you don't need very much attention, but slowly, as you go through the debates, I think you guys have now seen also how a debate develops over time, right? And you can see that initially you're just there with nothing, and then as the with every syllogism that gets added to the stack, you have to keep track of more and more stuff. So you need more attention to do so. You probably also need to keep in working memory all the stuff that's been said, so you can check like, oh, is this consistent or inconsistent with all the stuff I've agreed to in the past? And then at some point, lo and behold, you're going to get a tsa because you've managed to get inconsistent with yourself. Somewhere in the middle, there will also be emotional challenges. We'll watch a little bit of a video of a debate in our monastery lab. And if you see monks debate, it can be quite something. Like some people are gonna fight with each other, knock each other over. So there are emotional challenges, and that's also part of debate. And of course, you need clear reasoning, which is what we're training in this winter school. So those are components. How can you actually, those are components that are hypothesized, important. So how can we actually put these hypotheses to the test? Now, that's obviously really complicated, but these are our first attempt. So one of the things, so we can turn these components into more specific research questions. And here, by the way, you already get a peek at the Sarah J. Science Center during some of our studies, where you can see monks sitting there wearing EEG equipment, and some other people, both monks and Western scientists, sitting there and observing. So we asked what happened in the mind and brain during the debate. Is it a practice that cultivates attention, maybe similar to other meditation practices where we know that when people have to pay more attention, you can see increases in a brainwave called frontal midline theta. So theta waves are quite slow waves that are then in the front of the brain. They're 4 to 9 hertz. Maybe since it's clearly a social practice, as you guys have already noticed, maybe it also helps to cultivate some sense of social connection. Is there some way that we can measure this? And then also we can ask, what effects does debate have on cognition and emotion afterwards? Because of course the purpose of debate is not debating, as far as I understand, but really to cultivate some mind training, and not just to, maybe if not only to realize wisdom, but also to help develop some wholesome mental and emotional patterns. Okay, so those are some very broad research questions. Now let's get into trying to answer those. So to start to answer what happens in the mind and the brain during the debate, what we did was we actually fit monks with EEG equipment, which I brought in my suitcase from the Netherlands. Very fun. And then we asked the monks to debate. So this is one of our very first debates. You can see Geshe Tapkela sitting here at the computer, pressing a button whenever he noticed some interesting stuff. And then 3, 2. Then you can see here monks outfitted with EEG caps, and also one wearing a backpack with some boxes of equipment in there. And what they're going to do is debate, and we're just going to watch. We recorded videos, and Tapke is going to be pressing some buttons there whenever he noticed some of the important events that we specified beforehand. So let's go. 1.
두 손발이 넘어서 내려서
3, 2, 1.
가운데 무슨 일이세요? 말하시네. 만나면 두 손발이 넘어서 되라. 만났을 때다 그 내가 내가 좀 내가 뭐 하는다. 내가 아니 뭐 받아 줄 받아 줄 사람 두손 대라. 야, 그래서 내가 오지는 내가 내일 먹어 내일 나가 두손 야, 들리는 같은 거 손톱치기. 야, 두개 떨어졌는데 너무 지기 맞다. 오케이. 걔는 봐봐. 내가 또 개발하는 내가 또 개발하나.
And sometimes they also get really excited. So let me fast forward to where it gets a little bit more heated. Anyway, really fun to watch. You can see that by this time, we also need some science teachers to hold the wire so that the monks don't trip over them in all their excitement. So yeah, this is what we do. So what did we find? Well, what we did was we went back into this question of attention. You might remember that at the very beginning of my talk, I hypothesized that as the debate progresses, you need more and more attention. And there's some evidence from studies of meditators that the more you're zoomed in with your attention, the more you're completely absorbed, the more we see this increase in frontal midline theta. So would we tend to see an increase in frontal midline theta over the course of the debate? And then also I talked a little bit about social connection, because debate is a social connection. So one of the ways in recent times people have started to measure social connection is to measure the synchrony between brains of two people that are interacting. So we hypothesized that maybe over the course of the debate, people's brains would get more synchronized. So we decided to look at changes in interbrain synchrony between agreement and disagreement, and between focus and distraction. So let's have a look. What did we find? Oh yeah, I'm gonna skip most of this because I assume that most of you are not cognitive scientists, so this is a whole bunch of technical stuff. Most important is that anyone who knows a little bit about EEG is probably gonna say, wait, these monks, they are jumping around, moving. This is going to create lots of noise in the EEG signal, lots of artifacts. So what are you going to do about that? And what I then say is I use some fancy statistical methods to remove the noise. And actually, importantly, after cleanup, we didn't find much evidence for a difference in the noise level between the challengers and the defenders. So, you know, although there's going to be noise in the signal because we're collecting EEG in a real life situation, not like in a clean, quiet lab. I mean, this is a place where all kinds of people walk in, dogs might walk in, cows will be walking in, and then there's the person with the lawnmower passing by the lab and all of that fun stuff. So it's never going to be a really clean data, but at least it doesn't differ between the challenger and the defender. And then we just measure how synchronized the two brains are with a thing called a phase locking value, but don't worry about it. That's just scientific mumbo jumbo. And then, as I already pointed out in the video, we had senior monks, including Geshe Tatkela, watching for moments of agreement, as well as moments of focus and moments of distraction and moments of disagreement. So we could compare the brains during agreement to brains during disagreement, and brains during focus to brains during distraction. So that's what we're going to be doing here. It's just another view of the same of a similar kind of situation. So we had lots of monks coming through our labs, literally hundreds, which is great. Thank you so much to all the monks who are helping us out here and spending their time with us. And what we found, we did 2 studies because it's in science, it's always really important to not just believe one piece of data, but to repeat, to replicate. So in our first experiment, we hypothesized that since, you know, over time, you would need an increase in attention. Maybe you remember this figure from the beginning. So that would predict that there would be an increase in this frontal midline theta brainwave. So here what we see is we're looking on somebody's head from the top. So here's their little nose and there's their ears. And so we're looking at an EEG signal that's here in the middle, and that's shown here. And so you can see that the signal over the course of the debate, this is time, and this is the magnitude of these brainwaves, and you can see it increases. And red means beginner and blue means experience. So what you can also see is that for the experience, the data increases more than for the beginners. Don't worry about the absolute level because this is what's called normalized. So we've sort of corrected it for the fact that some people have bigger brainwaves, some have smaller brainwaves. So the absolute magnitude does not really mean something, but the change over time does mean something. So here you can see it increases. You can also see it decreases a little bit, but that's actually just an artifact, as we call it, because some debates were shorter, some were longer. So we had to, that's then if you average those things, then you get this weird drop down. Because the second study, we actually repeated the same thing, but now we distinguished between counting and logic debates. So you guys have both been practicing with counting and logic debates, right? And most of you will probably find that the counting debates are a bit easier. You don't need as much attention than as during the logic debates. And so we separated those, and indeed we found that during the counting debates, we don't see as much of an increase in this frontal midline theta signal that is thought to reflect attention and focus as during the logic debates. And you can also see again, well, you can now see that the signal doesn't go down, because here in the second study, now we knew a little bit what we're doing. So we said to every monk who was debating in our study, like, you have to stop at 10 minutes. Or in the case of the logic debates, you have to stop at 15 minutes. Like, we literally had an alarm that would go off and tell them to stop debating. And then the thing was gone, the drop down part of the signal. And the other thing you see is that, again, the blue lines showing the experienced monks, they were going up a lot more than the red lines, which are the beginner monks. So we published this in 2020, and then afterwards we collected a little bit more data to check whether indeed there was this effect of experience. So we also collected data from a few kids, I think it maybe 10 or so, from the local Tibetan children's village. And when they debated, they are of course not very experienced. They maybe debate 1 hour a week, where the monks of course debate 5 hours a day. So you can see that the kids almost don't show any increase in the frontal midline theta. Actually, these beginners have almost like a signal that goes down, if anything. So yeah, that's the part about attention. So it does help you to cultivate attention in similar ways as mindfulness meditation practices do. Then the other part of the study was we looked at the synchrony between the brains of the two debaters. Because synchrony between brain activity of two individuals has been shown to be involved in a lot of different things, like theory of mind. So thinking about what is the other person thinking, attention, coordination, empathy. So we were wondering what it was doing in debate. And to just make it a little bit more controlled, we thought, well, why don't we check whether the brains are more synchronized when the monks agree with each other compared to when they disagree. And this is what we found. Again, it's the same two studies, but now we're looking at this interbrain synchrony. Here on the left 2 bars, they're agreement, and the right 2 bars are disagreement. So you can see here that the interbrain synchrony, higher means the brains are more going up and down together. The interbrain synchrony is higher for agreement than for disagreement, and we could replicate this in experiment 2. Again, important point, so I'm repeating it. Don't believe in science when it's just one experiment. I think we've also all seen this a bit during the pandemic. If you just, I mean, there's lots of experiments that show lots of things, but what you really should believe is when experiments are repeated and they show the same thing, then you can start to believe it, because there's so much noise in the world that very often just statistical effects or some weird participants or weird animals or whatever you're testing can cause your signal to go the other way. So, but here we did find this consistent result between the two experiments, that the interbrain synchrony was higher during agreement and disagreement. We also compared the beginners in red and the more experienced monks in blue, and we found actually no consistent effect of beginner versus experience. And even if we just look separately, like, is there any signal that differentiates beginners and experienced? Well, it looked like there were different electrodes that showed a difference between beginners and experienced monks, but actually only in the first study, not in the second study. So here there's a sign, right? So first study sort of shows it, second study doesn't show it, so we don't replicate it, so we shouldn't really believe this very much. And if anything, the beginners had more interbrain synchrony than the experienced monks. So yeah. Anyway, experience has little effect on interbrain synchrony would be my conclusion. So you could say something like, if an experiment does not replicate, it follows that I have less confidence in the result, or I have little confidence in the result. That would be the syllogism way of saying that. We also have a little bit of data in a different study which shows that interbrain synchrony in the same kind of brainwaves is higher when the monks are reported to be focused compared to when they're distracted, both during accounting and logic debates. But this is not published yet. Cool. So then I have not very much time left, so I'm just going to go through this quickly, but also to point out that we also are looking at cognitive tasks. And this is really hard because we have all these weird tasks that are developed based on Western university students. And then you give those to Tibetan monks who have a very different education system. And so they look at your tasks like, what's this? And so, for example, we were like, well, can we measure logic and how the ability to reason logically, how that improves? So we took one of the tasks that has been used in the West to study logic, and literally some of the monks were saying, well, you know, it's a really interesting way to do logic. Like, one even asked me, like, can I have these materials? I would like to study it. It's like, not at all. Didn't seem like very familiar to what they were studying in debate. So I think this is a very profound point about how we do cognitive science. But anyway, for example, one of this task is like, okay, all engineers are swimmers, all swimmers are gardeners. What conclusion can you draw from this? Where obviously you could conclude that all engineers are gardeners. And then so there's lots of different questions like that. We did try to make them a little bit more Tibetanized. So we had them, we included some Tibetan names, for example. We thought about, you know, are those kind of things that would be in the worldview of a monk. But yes, still the shape of the task was very different from what they were used to, clearly. We did find in one experiment that experienced monks seemed to be a little better at logic. But in some replication of the task, actually it looked the other way around. So I'm still uncertain about what's going on here. But anyway, that's it. And, you know, just to demonstrate the problems we were running into was that, as you could see in the picture here, we ran many of the tasks on a tablet. But then, especially a few years ago when we were running our studies, not all of the monks actually were familiar with tablets. So we actually found that a lot of the more experienced monks were older necessarily, and the more experienced monks had less experience with tablets, because the younger monks might have gone to school in Indian secondary school, for example, and they were used to tablets, whereas the more experienced monks had been in the monastery and had been coming maybe from Tibet, and from maybe poor families, and so they didn't have access to a tablet, which is, of course, you know, something that as a privileged Westerner you don't tend to think very much about. So we actually found that the more experienced monks tended to be quite a bit slower in when you give them any task on a tablet, and they also in many of the tasks made more mistakes, but maybe that just said more about how well they were familiar with a tablet rather than their cognitive capacities. So we're still struggling to figure out how to measure these things in a way that also makes sense to Tibetan monks. So if you have any ideas, please let me know. But anyway, that's some of our findings from the tasks. And then the last project, which I was already alluding to at the beginning, is we're now doing every other week or so. We're doing Zoom sessions, and we're talking about statistics. And I'm very proud of my monastic collaborators because they've been learning so well. They've been really studying a lot. So here's Geshe Tapkela again, and some other monks and some of my students as well. And you know, they've been doing their own statistical analyses, which is really cool. And they've been working very, very hard to collect data in what we call a questionnaire study. So we ask monks about their emotions twice a day for a period of about 7 days. And then we look at how they differ between beginners and more experienced monks. And, you know, at moments when they debate, which, you know, most of the time, I think right now still they don't debate, but now they're started to debate again. So when they debate, we also look at the effects of debate on these thoughts and emotions. Because as you probably saw in the little video and maybe also experienced, quite a lot of emotions are going on during the debate. And maybe from the outside perspective, maybe that's even part of the purpose of the debate, because if you learn how to manage attacks, so to speak, in a sort of a playful situation like debate, maybe then the moment that somebody attacks you in real life, you can be much more flexible, have a lot more humor about it than if you haven't had that training. So we're kind of curious about that. So here are some of the analyses on the preliminary data so far. Here, for example, we look at negative affect as measured by a standardized questionnaire of negative affect or positive affect. So we see that during the pandemic, at least, less experienced monks on the left have higher negative affect than more experienced monks on the right. And this is basically just on the basis of their scores on these emotion questionnaire. So we're still doing a lot of analyses and also collecting more data to verify these results, because of course we need to replicate it before we can really believe the results. But anyway, I think it's very interesting to see what's going on there. And of course, very important, very relevant, because what's more important than people are negative emotions. So yeah, this is some of the work we're doing, looking at how monastic debate affects the mind and brain. And it seems like it helps us to cultivate attention and logical reasoning. It helps us to bring philosophy alive. It may also be beneficial for social connection, but we didn't really see clear differences in the brain. And there is a little bit of evidence for improvements in logic, but here we're still struggling with some how to measure that accurately. And doing cognitive experiments is difficult. And maybe the confrontational nature of this debate makes it a very good method to cultivate emotion regulation. So that's the end of my story. Of course, I'm very, very grateful to have had some funding for this. And then I want to end, and then I'm happy to answer your questions if you have them. Where I'm at spring, Germany, and sadly this is about the third time it's happening online, but it's a really fun place. Dunja will be teaching there as well about debate. So if you want, you can also learn a lot more about neuroscience, philosophy, computer science, AI, and many more things. And I'm one of the chairs, so you know, any moment, any chance I can get to spread the love is what I'm doing. So feel free to join that. I will also put the link to this in the chat when I'm done. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, Stefan already put it in the chat, so great. Thanks, Stefan. Yes, Rashika. Yes, perfect.
So I wanted to know, because you spoke about emotions as an aspect of the debate, so I wanted to know, have you found anything suggesting that this type of debate can like reduce refractory time when it comes to when emotion arise, like basically like refractory time when they go from having those emotions to be able to rationalize and actually listen to the other person. Do you have any um, anything suggesting that would help? And also, part of my reason for joining this debate was because I'm wondering, does it help the monks become like more open-minded and like examine things from multiple aspects, um, in order to like aid in making choices that are more aligned with their virtues? Have you found anything that
Right.
suggests that?
Well, great questions, Rashika. I would say the short answer is I haven't found firm scientific evidence for these things, but that's mostly because we don't know how to measure those things. But basically, informally, I can tell you that one of the most striking observations I've had as a Western academic coming into the monastery is literally seeing the monks just switch between these emotions like very, very rapidly. And, the one moment they can be like shouting and really angry at each other, and then the next moment they're just laughing and having the greatest fun forever, and especially the more experienced monks. So I would say it does surely look like they are having that. We did do an emotion regulation task where we showed disturbing pictures to the monks and compared that to sort of more neutral pictures. And then asked them to rate their emotions. But the challenge here is that, well, they might be just giving socially desirable answers about how it feels.
Mhm.
What we should really do is have some maybe physiological measure or something like that, but we haven't had a chance to do that yet.
So I'm just curious, and I'm not a scientist by any means, but I'm wondering, like, would it show like some increased activity, like in the medulla oblongata, or like frontal cord, like show more activities in area that correspond with emotions? I'm pretty sure there's different portions of the brain that correspond with different emotions, but I'm wondering, would you see like an increase in activity at that heightened moment that emotion is arising, and then kind of spike down when the emotions kind of residing, and also to like an increase in an area that's connected with logic. So I'm saying maybe it shows like the increase in heightened emotion, kind of the coming down of the emotion, and the increase of the brain that controls logic. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right. Um, those are good ideas. At the same time, you can only get such clear pictures of brain areas in fMRI, which is where you have to put the person in a giant scanner, which is by itself very
Oh yeah.
expensive. And then also they're lying down like this. So we don't have a scanner in the one. So that's a little bit challenging. With EEG, you just don't get that resolution. So yeah. But then I just wanted to get back to the open-minded.
Oh no,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. Now the open-minded. So actually one of the other actually before that, finish the emotions business, because one of the most consistent answers I've gotten when we've asked the monks, how do you feel like the debate really changes your mind, is they said, well, we feel like we're less angry. So that is also quite consistent qualitative evidence, at least for that. But then the other most consistent answer I get to that question is it helps us to see things from many different angles. I've literally heard that, well, many, many times from monks. And I feel that also the little debate practice I've done myself, I also feel like it's really allowed me to do that. But being able to see things from many different angles is a very complex thing to measure again. So one of the things I've considered trying is doing things like a creativity tasks, where, for example, one of the things you would do in such a task is you show like a pen, and then you ask the person, how many different ways can you use a pen? Like you can use it to write, but maybe also to stir your tea and to put it in your, do your hair with it or whatever. And so the more different ways people think of using a pen would be indicating more creative. But then again, it might also be a very Western centric way of measuring that. So there we run into that same problem. Yeah.
Thanks so much for answering my question. Your research is very interesting, so thank you for taking the time to explain that.
Sure, thank you. Okay, it looks like there's quite a few more questions. I think Anne was next.
Okay. Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'd like to know if similar studies have been done with other populations, particularly of populations with known deficits in the areas of things like attention, theory of mind, and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and the answer is clearly no. And I would also like to make use of this point to point out one big problem with our study design is that we're just comparing beginners to more experienced monks, and of course there's much more to it than just a difference in debate training. There's also been living in a monastery for 10, 15 years, right? That's another difference between beginners and more experienced monks. So we don't know from our studies whether whatever effects we're observing are the effects of debate versus the effects of just living in this monastic community, which I'm sure also has a profound effect. At least I've found that it really, just being there for a couple of weeks at a time also affected my mind really. But then I think to look at these populations that have deficiencies with attention and theory of mind, probably what you would really need to do to make it a bit more scientifically tractable is to come up with some short debate interventions, maybe actually based on the kind of things we're doing here at this winter school, where we're slowly developing a way to teach debate to people that don't have much of a background in Buddhist philosophy, most of them, or in specific ways of thinking that don't speak Tibetan, most of them, and in a very simple way. And maybe we can use that and try out like people that are suffering from attentional problems. Maybe this is a very nice gamified way to learn to pay more attention, because it's a bit more interesting than a lot of the attention training that's out there, and yet it's yeah, it might help people to cultivate this attention. And similarly for theory of mind, I can imagine that it can be quite beneficial, or maybe especially now with the pandemic, we've been seeing so much people getting stuck in conspiracy theories and all of those things, and maybe this can help you to really think more broadly, think outside your own box, your own bubble. So I would see that there's quite some potential for that, but we really need to do controlled studies where you just say, okay, this is going to be the very simple intervention. We're giving this to a bunch of people. We're giving a control intervention to another bunch of people, so they are still doing something. Maybe actually they're doing mindfulness or something like that, which they will also like. But then it's not debate by any stretch, and then we're seeing like what are the effects.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay, then I think next is Tial. I'm not sure how I should pronounce your name, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Mary Kay, for your talk. And actually, the question I have, I feel you partly addressed it in your last answer, but I'd still like to ask you. I was wondering that the debate that you are studying is happening within a very specific context where this is the logic and debate is used as a tool within a larger structure of a worldview, a philosophy, a meditation practice, and many other factors. So even though one might be testing, and trying to cancel out as much noise as possible and, wiring the monks while they're debating, how do you factor in or take into account that even if there's a comparative study between younger monks and more experienced monks, how do you factor in all these other parameters which are very much affecting the mind or consciousness? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. And I would say that that's a huge problem in our study, a huge confound. It's just that practically speaking, we weren't able to do anything better. But one of the things we were thinking of doing, and hopefully we'll be able to still do in the future, is maybe do a comparison with other monasteries where they spend less time debating. So you can say we keep monasteries more or less consistent. So it's monks that live in a monastery and have this particular lifestyle. They're this particular ethnicity roughly, and have these particular probably similar diets and all of that stuff, but they spend less time debating. And you know, the practical obstacles are just that this kind of research where you're really doing something very new, it's A, very difficult to find funding, B, you need to spend a long time really cultivating trust. So I'd say that maybe that's the biggest obstacle. So, you know, the fact that now we can actually have chats with each other on Zoom and we sort of understand each other. I remember the very first time I went there, I absolutely had no idea how I was supposed to talk to these monks, and I felt quite shy and quite nervous. And probably the monks, and well, Geshe Tafkila can probably share his perspective of those meetings, but for them probably it was just as weird, and we didn't have a language to understand each other. And it's only been now, after so many years, that I've started to get some appreciation of even what they were doing, because literally when you did that video that I showed, at that time we had absolutely no idea of what they were doing. We just saw them shout and clap and speak in Tibetan, but you know, and then they told us that they were talking about some grammar issue, and I was like, wow, okay, interesting. I didn't even know you could debate that, let alone get so excited about that. So it's a huge undertaking. Yeah, but I think those are really, really important considerations and questions to ask. So I'm very glad you brought it up, because it's a, you know, it's a good reminder to always be humble about those studies.
And sorry, just one last suggestion probably is that I think it's also very good to include women in these studies, because they're highly underrepresented. And now that we have geshemas and also, you know, yeah, basically female practitioners and scholars who have been in training for decades, it would be very good. Yeah, thank you. Of constraints, but just wanting to.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the cool thing is that this organization that's been helping us to develop the trust with these, with the Sarah J, for example, they've also developed relationships with the Geshima. So it used to be Science for Monks, and now it's called Science for Monks and Nuns. So hopefully in the future also I'll be able to go there with my team to collect some data there, because yeah, that would be very exciting. Okay, I think now there's some hands that are raised. So I don't know who was first, but maybe Victoria, do you want to come to the stage? Is that Victoria, or is somebody else raising their hands? I almost can't see it. Like, wait, how do I do that? Oh no, sorry, Tupten. Yeah, sorry, your name was overlapping with Victoria.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, it's a really great pleasure to be part of this winter debate. I had a really privilege to visit Sarah J Monastery for quite a number of years. I know Geshe Tafkela is here. I hope you remember me. We had a program called Interfaith Dialogue and Pilgrimage, and we used to take 30, 40 college students to different parts of South India to visit different religious centers, by the way. So yeah, so my question is, it's really interesting. I think there are a lot of work happening between the neuroscientists and, you know, especially the monks, what's happening in the brain and how the mind affects the you know, like the structure of the brain, the neuroplasticity and all. That's really interesting. And your research on specifically on the debate, that also is very fascinating. I think many have suggested, Tejas, as they said, that maybe we should include women and all. But I was wondering, I think that has also been addressed, not only the monks, especially, or maybe nuns in the future, but why not study other people in different fields, right? Like, for example, starting from your college, you know, what they don't do, they don't use the tools as a debate as we are using here, but still they have a reasoning skills and critical thinking skills and all, right? So maybe that kind of comparative studies might help us why or how this special tool of debating in the Buddhist monasteries and nunneries are really helping in controlling the emotions and like things like that. You have mentioned about some of the schools children in the TCV, I guess. So you have studied that, but maybe you can approach to some other schools, maybe to make it more inclusive, and then you'll have more data. Now that I used to remember when we were in the school, I used to wonder whether like why not meditation and debate are not introduced in the schools, and we didn't have that opportunity, but now it's been introduced. It's really, I'm glad. But yeah, I'm also right now included with some of the school education projects, and especially in Bhutan and India.
Wow.
And I've been debating with them why not include the pre-knowledge of Buddhist philosophy that we already have in our disposal. Why not use them? So I've just shared the live streaming with some of my people and say, please watch this and see how it could be interesting to include in the school system right from the young age, So yeah, so few suggestions and few thoughts to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tipton. Yes, and I agree. It'd be interesting to do these experiments. So actually, I myself 1 year, maybe that was also a precursor to this debate winter school. I tried to use some of these techniques from debating in my own classroom to get the students to think more critically about what do we mean with certain statistics, and if we how do we draw a conclusion about a particular statistical pattern. But what I ran into, and I think that that's the very real obstacle, the hurdle to this, is that it takes quite a bit of time to get into this mode of thinking of debate. So and schools don't have time. So I think what we're probably going to need to do is first create some, or not create, but collect some scientific evidence of controlled interventions, where you take, for example, a bunch of university students, look at the effects of debate, a debate intervention, kind of similar to what has been done with mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? So you have a manualized intervention, it's very standardized, and we're comparing that to some other intervention, and then we're empirically testing, like, what does it improve? So we have, my studies are some beginning at that, but I think not enough yet to justify like the time investment that would be needed from a school. Of course, TCVs do have some good experiences with that, so we can also learn from their experiences. And then some good efficient way of teaching this. So I think we're doing great work here, or Dunjula really is doing great work here to cultivate those kind of methods. And together we're trying those out, right? So in a way we're doing sort of empirical research here. We're empirical testing, beta testing of such interventions that might eventually be used more widely, I hope, and hopefully also be beneficial for people to cultivate more clear thinking skills, which are relevant for, well, pretty much anyone, I would say. Cool. So thanks. A very intriguing question. So I think next hand up is from Shmuel. Sorry again for mispronouncing your name, probably.
Hi. Hello. My question is, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Why do you think that measuring the effects of Nalanda debate on the brain is important?
Great question. And in a way, as weird as it sounds, as a neuroscientist myself, I sometimes ask myself that question, like, well, what can we even learn from the brain? Not very much, actually, because we know relatively little. At the same time, it seemed like it was a good idea. Well, first of all, for very practical reasons, that when we started this project, it was a very nice way to connect to the monks. And one should not underestimate the importance of really cultivating this bond of trust in the beginning of scientific research, because otherwise there's no way you can test this. And what's also very important, and that I didn't mention in my talk yet, is that this is a kind of research where we're trying to practice like giving and taking, in a way, you could say, where we're exchanging knowledge. So I'm not just there to get stuff from the monks. I'm hoping to also give stuff, which is stuff about how we do scientific research. And so the EEG was a great tool to help that communication, because the monks, I think, found it quite interesting. And it was something very concrete we could do together to slowly, in this process, cultivate a bond to get started. And then also the nice thing of EEG and of the brain is that maybe it's in a way less sensitive to a lot of these cultural biases that are inherent in these tasks, and also in judgment of emotions, because we also find that a lot of these Western standardized questionnaires are really targeted towards Westerners and might mean something quite different for monks. So the brain then is a bit less culturally biased, probably, but at the same time, yeah, how much do we know about the brain? That's a challenge. So nothing is perfect. So we better look at it from all angles, also scientifically speaking.
Okay, thank you.
So I think there's another question from Zonam Rington. Nice to meet you.
Am I audible?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for opportunity. I was wondering that since your presentation was very, very intriguing for me to learn more about the brain and the mind. So I was a little bit wondering about, as a born in a Buddhist family, and at the same time I'm surrounded with so many learned people, especially monks and nuns, who are meditating as well as debating very rigorously all the time. So some of specific monks and nuns who go to the mountains and meditate for almost 3 years and almost more than that. So I just would like to know that did you ever saw any something that impacts in the machine that you called FRMI, right? They're showing some wave, maybe a gamma wave, the spikes there when they are meditating. So is it also impacting on a daily basis that can be dealing with the conflicts and problems that we are facing nowadays all over the world? Is it that impacting them to deal more easier with that kind of problems? Is there's any kind of studies that you have experienced, please can you share? Yeah. So that we can also try. Also, I would like to know a little bit about if you have some. I just heard that the neuroscientist Richard Davidson, he was speaking to TED Talks about something that the meditation on compassion, maybe compassion and kindness and well-being of other, it also act as anti-inflammatory. I don't know whether it is implication of right now here or not. Please, can you share some your wisdom, please? Thank you.
Well, I don't know how much wisdom I have, but anyway, I'll give it a try. So that's lots of questions at once. So I personally have never really studied very long-term meditators, at least in terms of brain activity, apart from, well, the monks, of course, the debating monks from Sarah J Monastery. So I've been doing studies mostly with Western practitioners. Some of those are quite serious practitioners. So we have a Zen monastery close to where I live here in the Netherlands. And we did also one of these attention tasks. And we found that people who'd been practicing meditation a lot, so this would be shamatha and vipassana kind of meditation. And we found that when they were practicing what we call in scientific literature open monitoring meditation, which essentially is, I think, something comparable to shamatha without a support or an object, then we found that their mind was more flexible in this attention task compared to when they were practicing really strong focused attention meditation. So that's the little extent to which I've worked with these long-term meditators. I don't think anyone has really done solid studies on how these very long-term practitioners deal with very challenging situations. Although I think, well, there's of course the stories, the very impressive stories of the yogis and practitioners who've been dealing with horrendous circumstances in prison camps. That is some evidence for that ability. And there have been studies of just ordinary Westerners who've had some a little bit of mindfulness and meditation training, and then when they're subjected to a pain stimulus, that they report less feeling less unpleasant pain, and also you could see differences in their brain activity. So, well, their brain response to the pain, to the sensation of the pain, is still the same. The follow-up brain responses in the areas as sort of maybe emotional areas and so on, they are a bit less. And so they think that you really help these practices of at least, well, only mindfulness kind of meditations, that really helps people to reduce their response to pain. So that's the you know, the rigorous evidence that I know of. But how that relates to what we practice in debates, I don't know, because I don't think anyone has done this kind of study. But yeah, so it does seem there's something there in these meditation practices, and it's so much more to learn. Because as I mentioned before, a lot of these studies are also quite difficult to do. They take a lot of time to do them carefully and to come up with good ways of measuring it. So I've heard also Richie Davidson say at some point in a summer school that, you know, you can see very often with these experienced practitioners, whether they're actually be long-term debaters or long-term meditators of various kinds, you can often feel there's something about them. They have a very bright, so it feels like there's some brightness to their presence and some sense of lightness. At least that's what I usually feel when I encounter these kind of people. So I feel like there's something there, but how to measure that in a lab, I just don't know. So that's the big challenge, I think, in this kind of work. So yeah. Thank you so much for all your questions. And I think what we had also, oh, there's another person. Ida, do you want to still add something?
Yeah, hello, Marike, and thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, okay. I just wanted to go back to the last question and just mention something which is called the shamatha research by Clifford Saran, which is really interesting. And I had the impression that, I don't remember his name, but the last question was very much, where can I read something about this? And I think that might be really helpful to go into the Shamatha project by Cliff Saran and look at that. That's really interesting data. And there are lots of YouTube videos by Cliff Saran where he explains these things and the research and the evidence. So just a comment.
Yes, great. And actually, I would recommend in that vein, there is a very nice podcast from the Mind and Life Institute. And the very latest one, I'm going to put the link in the chat. The very latest one is an interview with Cliff Saran. So you can, that's, I think, a very accessible way of hearing about it. So hang on one second. Here you go. So and I think it's also the kind of level that's very interesting. Like they touch on both the more scientific dimensions of things, but also the bigger picture questions. So highly recommend that one. Great. So Charles is also wants to still ask a question. Yes, feel free to come on. Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, Yes. Well, as I understood, the debate was introduced for as a learning strategy, but I don't hear you talking about that. Did you research on that?
Yeah, so we thought about that. We didn't do research on that. Well, actually, that's incorrect. We did try to do an experiment where we looked at how well monks could remember associations between different words. It's a common way to measure memory. We did not find clear differences between beginners and more experienced monks, and there's various reasons why that could be the case. So it could be the case that both of these groups are, I mean, I think the beginners were already 6 years into the program, so maybe they already had learned how to memorize stuff quite well, so that's why we didn't see a difference. Or it could be the same problem of using a tablet that was plaguing us otherwise, so we didn't yeah, that's the extent to which we try to tackle that question. We've thought about doing something like studying where, you know, if you give somebody a text and then you either have them debate the text or just, you know, plain on try to memorize it, or maybe something else, some other learning strategy, and then comparing whether the debate leads to better understanding, better memorization. That would be, I think, the proper experiment to test that, but we haven't figured out how to, or we haven't had a chance to develop that experiment yet. Yeah, so much to do.
Thank you. It would be interesting, though.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also here, maybe a shortened debate intervention could be really helpful, because then you could take this to a setting where you take any naive participants and then give them this intervention, and then look at how the effects are on the way they study. And that could be much more tractable than taking the big package, where also of course every time we need to collect data, we need to burden a lot of monks and go to India or have them do it, and it takes that, I think that's a big bottleneck as well. So we'll see.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Great. And there's another hand from Andrew, I think.
Am I audible?
Perfect.
Hi, Professor. Good to see you again. I'm wondering about some methodological nuances that you might be engaging with. For example, I mean, Buddhism is at least to my understanding, it is a tradition that doesn't say too much about the relationship between the mind and the brain. And if anything, there's counterintuitive scriptures where there's an incapacity to locate consciousness within the mind, and there's the sky-like analogies and whatever else. So it seems that some scriptures are pointing us towards our mental states and whatever activation condition of our attitudes and whatever else. It's somehow omnipresent, so to say, right? That is scattered throughout the great space of the universe. So how do you kind of adjust? Because even though there can be, as you said, excellent results like Matthew Hickard's and everybody else's that works in the field, that does show some significant improvement as far as the well-being through meditative practice. How do you kind of adjust the methodology to resolve the tension that some of the texts are clearly pointing to the mind, or at least the lack thereof, in a way that you cannot locate it in the brain?
Yeah, well, I'm not at all an expert on this, and I can tell you probably the most common discussions I've had with monks when we're doing our research, where we often really try to make use of this opportunity to have a chat, like what kind of questions do you have for a Western neuroscientist, right? And so one of the most common questions is relation between the mind and brain, and I kind of always have to disappoint them with the statement that we don't really know very well how those relate. You know, it's a hard question. There is some relationship, and I think the Buddhist concept of, well, maybe just to honor Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist master who just passed away this past weekend, you know, interbeing in a way, you know, the inactive arising, as people would call it also in more philosophical terms. It's of sort there's a relationship, they're co-arising, they're dependent on each other, but exactly how is maybe even not scientifically tractable. I don't know, but there is clearly some relationship. So to that extent, I'm going to make use of the fact that, we know that certain patterns of brain activity tend to arise when you have certain mental processes going on. That doesn't mean that I'm making any claims about causality between the two. It's just that it's a convenient thing to measure, just like we use speech to infer what somebody is thinking. That, of course, doesn't tell us what they're thinking. Neither does, I'm also doing a lot of research in the mind-wandering field on, we're using machine learning algorithms to predict whether somebody is mind-wandering. That doesn't mean we literally know whether they're mind-wandering, but it gives us some best approximation, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And if I may ask a second question.
Sure.
You are right that there is a very profound pedagogical tradition, especially in the Tibetan tradition, to memorize texts as such. And there's extraordinarily clear benefits to brain health to have a good memory. So I'm wondering, do you see any kind of heuristic or pedagogical qualities we can understand from the Tibetan traditions of memorizing text that we can apply in our daily practices to also kind of improve and sharpen our cognitive skills as well?
Yeah. Well, again, this is mostly based on just my own experience, but I found that practicing the debates is a great motivator to memorize stuff. And we know that memorizing is great for brain health. So eventually, if we come up with some nice, accessible way of learning this debate skill, it might be a great game, maybe, quote unquote, game to learn to play also for elderly people to keep their brain healthy, because you're memorizing, you're using reasoning and logic, you're having fun with other people. I mean, all of those things are fantastic for old age. And actually, one of the other research ideas we've had and discussions we've had actually with the venerable abbot of Sergei Monastery is asking, well, maybe this has actually neuroprotective effects, so that some older monks seem like very, very bright and active, and it would make a lot of sense that these kind of practice actually also physically active, the physical components of debate, although as far as I understand, maybe some of the older monks don't practice it as much or at all. But I can imagine it's actually a great practice for people as they age because of these, physical activity involvements, the logic, memorization, just the social aspect of it, and the humor, because at least when I practice it, it's also just having a lot of fun together, which is important for our physical and mental health, especially as we age as well. So I would say that it seems pretty promising, but the bottleneck is that there's quite a learning curve involved in the beginning. So we need to figure out how to make it so that it's feasible to, for people to learn it and to practice it as they age. But yeah, would be a great idea. And yeah, at the same time, also I would love to study this over time, but that would be a multi-decade study. Like, imagine how cool it would be if we were to collect data from people that, say, are now entering the monastery, and then 30 years later, we'd follow them and compare them to people that maybe have left the monastery, or people that are also growing up in neighboring areas and not in the monastery, and then see how they're doing in terms of mental, physical health. That'd be very cool. Yes, I think Till, again, another question.
Yeah, hi, Mary-Kay. Sorry, mine is not a question, but I just wanted to add as a comment to the previous question, and maybe Geshe Thapkela or Tenzin Nanjongla Donyola are better poised to add to this, but I just wanted to say that in my understanding, there is a very coherent and explicit explanation on the difference between the brain and the mind, especially in Pramana Vartika, the text written by by Acharya Dharmakirti, one of the 17 Nalanda masters, and also known as the kind of father of Buddhist logic. And there is extensive discussion on what is the relationship between matter and consciousness. And I think the Buddhists very clearly posit that the mind and the brain are two. So it's not just about the location of the mind, you know, that whether you can place the location of the mind in the brain or not, that's really not, you know, that's just maybe one of the preliminary kind of things. But really, what is exactly the relationship between mind and brain? And then, yes, there is a level of codependency, but, you know, what is the substantial cause of the mind? What is the substantial cause of the brain? Are those two different? And I think many reasons and good arguments have been given as to why those two are different. So I just wanted to put it out there for people who have further interest to definitely look at that text, especially chapter 2. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that comment. Yeah, so obviously I wasn't talking about the Buddhist philosophical background because I don't know enough about that to make any sensible comments there. But I would say that from a scientific perspective, of course, the problem is just that even how do we define the mind? I mean, I don't think there's any agreed upon definition. Consciousness, even worse. How do you define the brain? I guess that there we can start to get somewhere. But you know, if you don't know then what the mind is, then how can you answer that question from a scientific perspective? So I think that that's the difficulty. The relationship between the subjective and objective is really quite contentious. So this is actually also why I'm into research on mind wandering, because it's a very interesting crossing place, you could say, between the subjective and the objective. So normally a lot of cognitive neuroscience, so the study of cognition in the brain, is about asking people to do a task, and then we don't have to ask them direct questions. We just see how they do the task and then what's happening in the brain, and infer from that how attention works, for example, how memory works, how the brain works, how the brain is involved in those things. But we're not asking the person what's happening in their brain or their mind subjectively. And in mind wandering, the thing is that you're not asking them to tell stories about their brain or their mind, but you're asking them very direct questions while they do these very contrived and boring tasks, but very controlled tasks. And in that way, you're trying to build a bridge between the subjective of, you know, what the person thinks is going on. So, for example, we would ask them, at this moment, were you paying attention to the task or were you paying attention to something else? And then that allows you to see what's different in the brain. And you do find that, for example, often when people say they're not paying attention to the task, that their brain also responds less to light flashes or incoming stimulation than when they say they were paying attention to the task. So when they're saying they're off task, their brain responds less. So yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for all these questions. I think maybe I have to ask Dunyola and Stefan what would be the best way to move about, because originally I think we also wanted to do some debate, either of you guys or of me being debated by someone. But let's see, what do you guys think?
Well, we don't have too much time left, so I'm not sure if we should just, well, we could do a few minutes of debate. We have 10 minutes, right? Let's see. Okay, it sounds like we got feedback. That's not a hand. That was some kind of symbol. So
that was a party symbol.
That's a party symbol. Yes. Okay. That means let's have a party. So I actually, though, if it's all right, just wanted to make one comment about some of the Q&A that just was going on, and how with that very last question, one other, feature of the philosophical tradition that Nalanda debate is, rests upon in this, Pramanavartika, primarily that tradition and the Buddhist psychology more broadly. One area could be in helping to kind of have more nuanced theories about, sort of the causality between mental states and the behaviors that are the things that are able to be observed and recorded as data for the scientific research, because there's just a very precise, nuanced, and robust, understanding and theory of emotion to begin with, right? So, and that could be, if that is able to be brought into the scientific research a little bit more, it could help to, understand the data, or at least to bring more nuance to certain data. And then just to comment on the question that came up at first. Sorry.
Sorry, maybe I can also just chime in with that and add on that, is that one of the things we've been talking about with each other also is to see, like, can we really talk through different conceptual systems? So we have the scientific, the cognitive system. How does that relate to the Buddhist philosophical system? Well, not just one, of course, it's many systems, and that's what Geshe Tapkela and Dunyola and all of those people are experts on. And can we learn from each other? And actually what's very interesting is that in Western cognitive science and psychology, there's now more and more calls for better theory. So most of the time, what they then think about is mathematical theories, for example. But what if we maybe try to come up with some different sources of theories of people who really thought about this for thousands of years? So, yeah.
Right, and one example, just to go back to I think one of the first questions that came up asked by Rashika, which is really nice, about the refractory period after having some kind of emotional response and being kind of going back to baseline or equanimity. And one of the kind of confusions or the places of possible misinterpretation of data is if you see a reaction that we normally would classify or think of as anger, or that if it felt in yourself might be anger. But then to recognize, like, within the philosophical and psychological framework that is learned by the monks doing this practice, and that is the way they look at their own emotions, that emotion itself is not a distinct category from cognition. In other words, emotions are defined in terms of their cognitive component, in terms of their cognitive mode of appraisal, as opposed to an affect. So emotions are never defined in terms of an affect. They're always defined in terms of their cognitive mode of appraisal, which then you could see how there can be something that maybe has some affective quality that's similar to what we think of as anger, but actually, and so results in a sort of external expression, but actually the cognitive mode of appraisal is quite different. So there's not what we would call the, grasping the object as truly existent, is in the Buddhist phrasing, but I'm sure there's a way we could phrase that scientifically that would make sense, somehow dissociating from, a solidifying of the object, or some kind of, reifying of the object or something. So that's really, part of the emotional regulation training that is emphasized in the Nalanda tradition, is to inhibit the general habit of reifying an object. And so any emotional response to that object is quite different than when that reifying pattern is engaged. So just wanted to point that out. And Rashika has come back, so maybe you have another question again.
I'm sorry. Is it okay if I walk on the stage? Am I supposed to be doing that, or am I supposed to be raising my hand?
No, for questions, yeah. I mean, that's totally fine. I guess because I chimed in, then that is good that it raised another question. But now we probably have to put the debate on hold because we're running close to time. But we'll pick it up. Please,
then I don't want to do that then.
No, we don't really have time anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Please go ahead, Rashika.
Well, basically what I was thinking about to the statement that you were making, is that kind of akin to, say, when a parent yells at their child to get out of the road. It's not necessarily out of anger. It sounds forceful, and the affect may be appearing as though the parent is perturbed or angered. But like you said, that conscience, that isn't actually there. That seed of anger isn't there. It's just, but they appear to be more forceful. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, I mean, in the in the case where the parent in question doesn't have anger, now of course parents can actually give rise to anger, and here the distinction simply being, do they have a sense of reified object, that their child is a reified object that's doing something bad that they need to put a stop to, and with a kind of over exaggerated reaction, or is it a realistic reaction that just sees that if they don't stop their child, they could get harmed, and and then is really motivated by a compassion. So that's the thing where the external behaviors actually make it quite hard to discern the actual mental states going on. Now, could somehow instruments be able to discern those? Instruments like EEG or fMRI. It's possible, but certainly we're far from that level of nuance in those. But certainly, through introspection, one can make those determinations and distinctions.
Yeah, I get it. It's because the mental, there's no way that we can assess the mental processes of that individual. So in fact, there may be some reification taking place, which would then give rise to anger, or there may not be. It may be completely out of compassion, but because we don't have that ability, we can't understand those person's mental. Is that correct?
That seems to be right, and Geshe Tupke might know better if there is some way to determine from an external behavior if someone has that kind of reification occurring or not. But from what I've been able to glean, it doesn't seem like there's a way.
Yeah, we do look in our lab at the tendency to get stuck on things, which is not quite the same as reification, but I think it has some relationship. And we find that when people say it was quite difficult to let go of the thought, that their brain is a bit different than when they find it more easy to let go of the thought. So, and that's, for example, also when people find it more difficult to let go of the thoughts, we tend to see that their brain responds less to incoming stimuli than when they find it easy to let go of the thoughts. So it's as if your brain is just more internally directed. But that's the little we know about it so far.
Yeah, so that's the cool thing, is that, very creative kind of proxies for maybe these kinds of internal mental states that you can get a little more clarity about. And that does seem like a reasonable proxy for it. Yeah. Oh, cool. Maybe Stefan, if you could come back up and help us kind of wind down.
Sure. What did you have in mind with winding down?
Well, I think the time is almost up. So, I mean, unless maybe we can make an option to do a little bit of a debate for people who don't mind staying on an extra 10 or so minutes. And if Marika, yourself, have an extra 10 or so minutes, but I want to respect the time schedule that it's almost time to end the session.
Yeah, I'm afraid that actually I won't be able to stay much longer. In about 40 minutes, I need to be present at a online panel of Mind Alive Europe about standing at the edge. So I need to to get myself ready for that as well. Sorry about that. So that's what I'm talking about. That's why this week is crazy, but lovely as well. Yeah.
Okay, so then I think, and thank you very much, Marika, for being able to then take this time when you have other conferences going on, several it seems. So that was very, very, I think we have created a document that has a sort of rough outline of a debate that includes some of the issues that Marika has been researching, not the one she spoke about specifically so much, because that's more her mind. The debate is more about the mind wandering research, but that we can use later, or you could do an example, or you guys can use it during the practice session to try and see what it's like to debate a science topic, right? What might it be like to be a researcher in cognitive science, and to use this debate format to get clearer about, okay, what are we saying this mind wandering is? How does it relate to something like mindfulness? And so that's the document, that's the day 3.2 debate example, cognitive science, that document that was sent out earlier today or yesterday. So good. So I think we're gonna have to. So Marika, we can ask you, or say thank you for your presence and that you're free to go, and then we'll still stick around if there's any last questions about just like because we didn't really get to any practice debate, so maybe we'll just spend a minute to kind of go over what we're going to practice in the next session, and we'll just do some kind of that housekeeping kind of thing. Okay, so just double check.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me. And also, I will try to see maybe even if I can pop in some randomly in the middle of a session somewhere. So yeah, then you guys can find me and even have a chat or debate or something. So yeah, it was so lovely to meet you. And I was so excited. So many people are here to learn to debate, and lots of good luck together. And I will see you at least on the WhatsApp group sometimes. So bye.
Thank you very much for joining. It was lovely to see you and hear you again.
Great. So so I know people did want to see that debate, so that we will try and make space for Marika if she's able to come by again in the next couple of days. But for now, we can use sort of the rough outline I mentioned to ourselves as for people who are kind of have enough feeling of confidence in the debate method to go beyond the other drills. We have that document that gives you an outline that you can use this for your next debate session. And then, of course, we have the drills from this morning and from the last few days, which clearly we all could continue going through because there's a lot there, and it's difficult material, so we all need to continue practicing and kind of. But that now we have this cognitive science debate example that you can use to say, okay, now how would I actually start using this debate method to tackle a scientific question? Or again, we're saying a scientific question. It's the same questions that we have if we are interested in Buddhist philosophy and psychology, right? It's also a Buddhist question, or psychology. It's a psychology question, a question about certain mental behaviors and factors. Okay, so if anyone else has any last question, I'll stick around to answer that, and otherwise we'll see you all at the next debate session. Thank you for the questions too.